Enga mana, enga reo, enga rau rangatira, o ngā hoa whā, tēnā koutou katoa. Talofa lava, maloa lele, nisa bula vinaka, and benvenuti. Welcome to this evening's inaugural lecture. My name is Bryony James. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Te Rangiwaka. This is the first inaugural lecture I am doing as Vice-Chancellor, so I am delighted it's Giacomo's. The joy of inaugural lectures is a quirk of university tradition, where we ask someone, in this case, the wonderful Giacomo Lichtner, who has given dozens, hundreds, possibly thousands of lectures during his career, to give his inaugural lecture. Because this is how we celebrate our newest professors. When someone reaches the pinnacle of an academic career and we make them a professor, they get the pleasure and privilege of giving an inaugural lecture to their friends, their family, and their colleagues. And that's what we're here to celebrate tonight. So welcome this evening. Thank you for coming out on this wintry Wellington evening. A special welcome to His Excellency the Italian Ambassador, and a very warm welcome to Professor Lichtner's family and friends, and his colleagues from the School of History, Philosophy, Political Science, and International Relations. This evening we have the pleasure to hear Giacomo's lecture titled Encounters with the Historical Imagination. Giacomo is an interdisciplinary cultural historian. He is internationally recognized as a leading voice of his generation for his original work on memory and representation of the Holocaust, fascism, and the Second World War. Following his PhD at Reading University in the UK and his move to New Zealand in 2003, he has established himself as an authority in these areas, with research weaving together 20th century European history, memory studies, and film studies. His research illuminates the role of historical cinema in the construction of collective memory. One of his major works is the monograph Film and the Shoah in France and Italy, in which he analyses the parallel but distinct way those two countries coped with their complex local and shared legacies. In his subsequent monograph, Fascism in Italian Cinema Since 1945, The Politics and Aesthetics of Memory, he makes a bold case for the use of film as a form of proactive sense-making of challenging histories. The deep understanding and profound humanity that Giacomo brings to his work means that he's a trusted and steadfast voice in public engagement, encouraging nuanced, thoughtful debate about difficult histories and their impacts on contemporary society. That work has led to a major collaborative project co-led with Professor Sally Hill on how to manage Italian fascist heritage. The project is called Reframing, Revisiting or Removing, Making Fascism Visible in Contemporary Italy. In this evening's lecture, Giacomo will weave together his strands of research to consider the contested role that imagination plays in history, including how imagination tethers us to the past whilst simultaneously freeing us from it, how imagination helps us to fill gaps in evidence and dream up new questions, and how it informs the construction of national narratives of the past. Giacomo makes it clear in all that he does, in both his teaching and his research, that the survivor's voice remains crucial, and you will hear him talk this evening about how essential it is to keep it at the centre of everything we do. The lecture will start by looking at the place of imagination in Holocaust studies, a subject close to Giacomo's heart due to his own family history and his work with the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, where he currently serves as the Deputy Chair. I know I'm not alone in very much looking forward to hearing from Giacomo this evening, so please join me in welcoming Professor Lichtner to the lectern.
e nā mana, e nā reo, e nā iwi, e ro rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. E nā tumu whakarae, tenei te miki ki a koe, nā miki nui ki a koe. Nā tāwira, nā kaimaki o te renga waka, tēnā tātou. Ko tēnei taku mihi ki nā tangata whenua, o te rohe nei, taranaki whānui ki Ngāti Toa Rangatira. Kia tō mai te aroha, me te mana akitanga o te atua, tēnā koutou i o koutou tini mate kua wehe ki te pō. Te unga mate ki te unga mate, te unga ora ki te unga ora, āpiti hono, tātai ono. Ko nā fuke e whitu o Roma te monga, ko tevere te awa, ko Levi toku iwi, ko Lichtner toku hapu mai te whenua o Hanekari, ko Pasili toku hapu mai te whenua o Itaria, ko te renga woka toku marae, ko Giacomo Lichtner toku inoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Vice Chancellor, colleagues, students and alumni, friends, Stephen, there's a seat right at the front. Friends of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, good evening, buonasera, and welcome to you all. I was going to thank people for leaving a few seats at the front to make me feel more like it's a standard first-year lecture, but now they're taken. What I do want to do, however, at the outset is thank the team that organized the event, Kate, Alexia, the whole team. You're absolutely wonderful. I want to acknowledge my family, my fairly fabulous Nikki, my daughters, Rebecca and Sarah, who are more resilient, braver, and more imaginative than I'll ever be. And watching from afar, my brothers Yehuda and Akiva, my sister Valentina, and our remarkable parents, Rodolfo Lichtner and Christina Vasili of blessed memory. My mother, who literally jumped with joy when I was admitted to study in the UK, even though it meant farewelling the last of her children. If my father is responsible for my love of history, it is probably thanks to my mother that I took the choices that led me here. Oh, sorry. And what good choices there were, eh, Nikki? 23 years ago. Not all our choices, of course, and I want to thank Professors Shekhar Bantyopadhyay and Stephen Levine, who are in the room, and Professor Shalom MacDonald, who's watching, for taking a chance on a boy from the other side of the world on the grounds of an interview held over a dodgy landline. Who would have imagined that you'd be stuck with me for so long? With thanks to Margarita Petchenko for the tip, I would like to begin with a story. A famed Hasidic story, one of those that has been told countless times, never quite in the same way. One of those that exist between the physical and spiritual realms, where the imaginary is real and the real imaginary. Once, when his community was under threat, the Baal Shem Tov, the great 18th century Jewish mystic, went into the forest, and in a secret location, he lit a fire and recited an incantation to solicit a miracle, which promptly was granted. A generation later, when another disaster loomed, his disciple, the Maggid of Mezrich, visited the same place in the forest. He could no longer remember the verses, the words of the prayer, but he lit a fire, and that was enough. Years later, his disciple, Moshe Leib of Sasov, also needed a miracle. He could no longer recite the prayers or light the fire, but he found his way to the secret forest location, and that was enough. Until the time came when a disciple of the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, Israel of Rizhin, also had to intercede with God. He could not remember the words or light the fire, and try as he might, he could not find the right place in the forest. So he stood in the forest, and he told this story, and that was enough. As long as there is memory and intent, generations have been taught, there is hope. This story resonates both in my work as an historian and in my own family's story, because the Holocaust cut down the forest, extinguished the fire, erased the words, and corrupted the very language in which we tell the stories. While some have replanted and learnt anew, for others, memory and intent are no longer enough. We also need to excavate and to imagine. My Mihi is an exercise in historical imagination. It's a grounding in deep but hidden ground. Who were these Hungarian Lichtners I claim as my lineage? All I knew was that my grandfather Julia and his brother Dezső were the only two of 7 brothers to survive the Holocaust. Julia had done so in Italy, where he was living and working as a GP and gynecologist when the war broke out. He had married a Catholic woman in 1938, just after the racial laws had forbidden him to do so. They eloped anyway and wrote a postcard home. When the fascist Italian police came to arrest him in February 1944, as he told the story, he was examining a pregnant woman. Having shamed the policeman into waiting outside, he jumped out of the window and hid for the rest of the war. That's quite a cool story, but it's not much. Still, it's a lot more than I have of my mother's family. My grandfather, Rodolfo, a Jewish Florentine railway worker, sacked by the racial laws, and his brother Enzo and their mother Stella, all deported to Auschwitz, never to return. My surviving grandfather hardly ever spoke of the war, at least not to his grandchildren, but we knew clearly that they were Hungarian Jews from Miskolc in northern Hungary, and we had this picture, which you've already seen. Moritz, the chaplainesque father, Anna Golda, the matriarch, and 7 sons, only 6 in the picture, Marcel, Zoltan, Derek, Lajos, Julia, Dezső, and Bela. Bourgeois, secular, integrated. My father remembers being told that they had originally come from Galicia in Poland, while my uncle was told they came from Austerlitz, the site of the Napoleonic battle, which is in Moravia. In fact, my great-grandparents were born in the Transylvanian regions of Satmar and Bihor. Mor was a tailor, born in Peleșin, which is now in Romania, but was then Nagypilescu in Hungary. His bride-to-be, Gal de Gros, the daughter of a shoemaker, came from Valea lui Mihai, then Mihaili Folva, where they were married. Their witness was Lipot Klein, another tailor who had married Mor's sister, Rosalia. The trail that leads to them is a mire of Jewish first names and Jewish surnames, each spelled 3 different ways, courtesy of Yiddish transliteration, and scattered across Eastern Europe, from Serbia to Prague, via Budapest, and, of course, Vienna. But with due gratitude to Habsburg bureaucracy, I can trace Gal de Gros's parents to Ladomirov in eastern Slovakia, near Ukraine, and to Porubka and Trenchin, also in Slovakia, but more to the west, about 100 kilometers southeast of the battlefield of Austerlitz. Close enough, perhaps, to imagine seeing French or Austrian or Russian troops marching through their town. But this is not imagination, it is speculation, legend. The imagination that interests me here is in the context that these stories provide. A picture of mobility within a region, of Transylvania shtetls, of ancestral trades, of skillful matchmakers making matches between people from nearby centers and the same social class. And above all, perhaps, a picture of the coming of modernity, which is not only a Jewish story. The familiar transition from multi-ethnic empire to nation-state and its disruption of pre-existing cultural and social bonds. Urbanization, de-skilling, education and re-skilling, secularization, class mobility. In thinking about these things that I don't know, I literally imagine, in the sense that my mind creates images of what their life, they, might have been like. And that is where stories, fundamental though they are, become history. George Steiner once wrote that history is exact imagining. Although we might call it insight or intuition, the organization of facts into narrative requires imagination. Imagination helps us make the past into history. But what happens when the events, the people, the emotions we're trying to reconstruct are beyond us, or defy imagination on physical, emotional, or ethical grounds? Much more than my efforts to reimagine severed roots into existence, the history of the Holocaust rotates around an altogether darker philosophical and historiographical debate over imagination. Should we imagine the gas chambers, the epicenter of the history of that genocide and an unprecedented method of organized mass extermination? And if so, how? How do we imagine it when we have no visual reference and, crucially, no testimony? Should we imagine dehumanization, such a defining yet intimate, subjective, and fundamentally elusive aspect of Holocaust history? Georges Didier Huberman, the French philosopher, suggests that imagination is central to the ability to synthesize information and therefore to know. In Images in Spite of All, he writes, "Imagination is not identification, and even less hallucination. To approach does not mean to appropriate." Yet others disagree. To try to imagine the unimaginable can only result in a caricature, a mockery of reality. Because imagination is not simply a messenger, but it has agency and the capability to change, deconstruct, or reassemble the facts. In other words, to invent. It would be our imagination used to reconstruct somebody else's experience. Appropriation and voyeurism cannot be so easily discounted. Within this cautious framework, Claude Lanzmann sees these 4 photos, snatched by the 12th Auschwitz Sonderkommando in 1944, as dangerous, even immoral, because they replace a detail for the whole and give the illusion of understanding. Yet, through a different lens, the Sonderkommando images are invaluable. Dan Stone has shown that their importance is not in what they show, but in their urgency and authenticity, and even in their ambiguity. They make us feel both there and not there, see and not see. That paradox of proximity and distance is at the center of Holocaust history. And by making us strain to see, these photos replicate the almost archaeological work that the historian has to undertake to reconstruct what the Holocaust meant in essence. It's an ambiguity studying with varying degrees of success in Holocaust cinema, and nowhere more so than in the critical question of whether and how to represent fictionally the gas chambers, a haunted space that filmmakers first approached only in 1978, and which now counts several attempts. Confronted with the violence, the horror, the shame, the disgust of the process of asphyxiation, filmmakers have identified in the peephole, and more generally in the threshold of the chambers, a helpful and intriguing, and I would add, very problematic trope to navigate and often flounder in the paradox of distance and proximity. In Amen, by Costa Gavras, the director centers our responsibility and our agency by teasing us with the expectation of a reverse angle that thankfully never materializes.
rather horrible.
Other filmmakers have not been so restrained, but we won't be watching them tonight. This is a debate constantly renewed as memory changes from that of the eyewitness to the vicarious one of second and third generation survivors, as remembrance becomes institutionalized, as self-imposed representational and narrative boundaries are tested, and most importantly, as technology improves to allow ever more immersive experiences designed to aid the imagination. In the last 10 years, virtual reality and 3D cinema have opened new opportunities that inhabit a broad spectrum of quality and ethics. From the Shoah Foundation's thoughtful, ghostly VR experience, The Last Goodbye, which lets you travel through Majdanek alongside survivor Pinkas Gutter, to the 360-degree virtual reality German documentary Inside Auschwitz, which pairs modern-day footage of Auschwitz-Birkenau with 3 testimonies of Holocaust survivors and lets you direct the camera to look all around you and above. So, all the way to the frankly disturbing Witness Auschwitz, the VR headset concept developed in 2017 by Italian game studio 101%, which promised to, and I quote, give you the opportunity to live inside the camp and have your own experience, while promising also to not to delve in the experience of violence. You may have to put up with 20 seconds of this one.
Aussteigen, aussteigen. Haltet ein. Los, vorwärts. Bewegung, Bewegung. Schnell.
Many other attempts have since been made, and I'm thinking in particular of the haunting interactive holograms of Holocaust survivors at the Sydney Holocaust Museum's Reverberations exhibit, which I recommend to you, but which personally I almost literally fled from. They were very striking for me anyway. Oh. Collectively, these case studies begin to paint a picture of what's necessary to chart an ethical path through the use of immersive technologies to convey Holocaust experiences. First, it's always the survivor's voice, not the illusion of being there, that makes the difference in terms of imagination and understanding. Second, you do not need to see, let alone experience it to engage with the experience. Thirdly, the potential to tease with the illusion of being able to feel what it was like is higher with these media. We must be aware of these and to avoid exploitation and voyeurism. And fourthly, the historical imagination is not about seeing what's not there, but about understanding what's remote from us. An historian trains to avoid presentism by thinking about the past as it would have felt to those who lived through it, rather than to us and our readers. In the practice of writing history, imagination and empathy intertwine. These same principles guided me and executive producer Deborah Hart in producing Thomas Burstin's and Dan Brown's new educational documentary, We Were Just Children, which uses animation created through an artificial intelligence engine to illustrate some aspects of survivor stories.
Had people coming to play music at home. My sister Clara played the violin, Dora sang soprano. Often came friends of theirs playing piano and they would be singing, father would be singing. I just was too lazy, and because I was the last one, they weren't very interested, I don't think. They said, oh, well, if you don't want it, you don't want it.
While our parents had a business in Berlin, we spent a lot of our spare time after school at the shop, at the business, and there, for unknown reason, we always played with merchandise, as though we pretended it was our business.
My father, he was everybody's friend, a person you instantly liked. Children instantly loved him, animals instantly loved him. Going for a walk with him was like going for a walk with Pied Piper. He would have all the children behind him and all the dogs and the cats and the chickens. And he was a very modest, humble, simple man, but he had this capacity for friendship.
Our use of AI was designed here was designed to evoke the past, not reconstruct it, and to facilitate an understanding not of the Holocaust, but of the line between the representable and the unrepresentable. The machine's ability to digest historical records and recreate the young survivor's self was impressive, sometimes, perhaps surprisingly, even moving. Even so, the task was not a simple one. As much as the human prompts followed our guidelines, the machine tended towards simplification, towards anachronism, and to indulge in the illusion of realism. Much work and debate, and the filmmaker's infinite patience towards a pedantic historian, went into editing, refining, and most of all in choosing what to show and what not to show. We found that the machine dealt better with what was already highly evocative, such as Stephen Sedley's wonderful memory of his father, in happier days before the persecution, but interestingly struggled with the same images that the human imagination struggles with. Bob Narev's account of his deportation from Berlin, for instance, stumped it in sometimes contradictory ways. Like most German and Austrian Jews, Bob's family had been deported in third-class passenger carriages, not cattle cars, to safeguard not them, but the sensitivities of their civilized German and Austrian neighbors. But the collective imaginary expects a cattle car. What to do about that? Well, the answer was simple. The collective imaginary will just have to come to terms with the complexities of historical truth. On the other hand, when asked repeatedly to account for the extreme overcrowding of Bob's train, the machine's referent was clearly a busy commuter train, not a deportation transport from Berlin to Theresienstadt. Can we blame it? Are our references also not inadequate? After several attempts and some angst, we found the answer both in Bob's testimony and in the testimony of Primo Levi and many others, countless others, who deliberately withdraw when retelling the suffering of the train journey, to protect the dignity of those who travel with them, So the answer was here to focus narrowly on the individual that the story and the experience belong to. And that's Bob in the middle there. And the solution, it strikes me now, was arguably the same as it would have been for any tool of representation, for the camera or for the hand of a skilled illustrator, foregrounding the survivor and following their lead in determining the ethics of what should be shown, what can be shown, and what should not. Only in reflecting upon it after the event did it occur to me that that was the same solution that in the very human, very much not artificial intelligence of Sarah Lang's beautiful graphic novel adaptation of Giacomo de Benedetti's 16 Ottobre 43, which I had the pleasure of curating some years ago with the support of the Embassy of Italy. Closing in on the human in the face of the Nazis' dehumanizing design, evoking rather than showing, and applying our imagination and through it our empathy only to those elements that we can understand. The care of a parent, the innocence of a child, the anxiousness of the everyday. This need for restraint and deliberation in interacting with the imagination defines the challenges of Holocaust representation, which have remained remarkably consistent from the moment the first cameras entered the camps with the Allies to the most modern and experimental Holocaust films. In my work on the British Army's liberation footage from Belsen at the Imperial War Museum in London, I was shaken to find this note. Sent from the British Army Film Unit Sergeants Lewis and Oakes to Sidney Bernstein and the London-based producers working on a documentary entitled German Concentration Camps, Factual Survey. The note was written on 21 April, 5 days after the liberation. Until then, the British Army had used bulldozers only to dig vast mass graves in which to bury the roughly 5,000 corpses they had found, putting German POWs to do the work of transporting manually the bodies. But the work was too slow, typhus was threatening, and bulldozers were efficient. The note continues. Now, these are soldier cameramen, hardened by filming the Allies' 10-month advance from Normandy to Germany. They're not new to atrocities. In the days immediately before this note was written, they have filmed everything, sometimes getting uncomfortably, almost immorally close, in order to chronicle the unadorned facts, as Richard Dimbleby called them in his first seminal report for the BBC from Bergen-Belsen. Yet here their response is different. They step back. Perhaps inadvertently, they too foreground the survivor witness so that the bulldozer and its work are out of focus, almost literally off stage, ob scena, ob scene. Like the Roman poet Ovid said that dramaturgists should deal with extreme violence, such as Medea murdering her children. 70 years later, Laszlo Nemes's extraordinary Son of Saul would use a similar technique through shallow focus. In telling the fictional story of Saul, a Jewish Sonderkommando worker in Birkenau who is desperate to give his son a burial instead of letting the crematoria devour him with the others, Nemes trains the camera closely on Saul's shoulder so that all that he witnesses is out of focus for us. The whole film, as Nemes states, is a close-up, a portrait of a man. Activated through the language of representation, whether using the grammar of cinema or of graphic novels or of literature or poetry or statues and sculpture, whatever, our imagination becomes what Didi Uberman, following Hannah Arendt and Kant, calls the condition of memory, belonging to the faculties of association, that is, of connecting the no longer with the not yet. In few places have I seen this better shown than in this moment from Emmanuel Finkiel's Voyage, a wonderful study of memory and silence. The first part of memory and silence. The first part of the film follows a group of French Jews, mostly Holocaust survivors and mostly non-professional actors, returning to Poland on an organized tour. With them is the son of one of the survivors, a middle-aged man resentful to have to engage with his father's traumatic memories, and a bunch of grandchildren eagerly filming everything for a school project. When the bus breaks down on the road between Krakow and Auschwitz, in the freezing Polish winter, the survivor's son leaves the bus to urinate.
Henri!
Lulaf, pour la prière de Sukkot. C'était pourtant un beau pays.
The railway track works here as an involuntary activation of post-memory, a quasi-memory of an inherited traumatic past that the second generation has not lived through, but all too often has to work through in their relationship with their survivor parents. The second generation leaves an ephemeral footprint in the ice, while the landscape itself speaks to the first generation not only of horror, but also of life before it. Thus, a single sequence, without reconstructing anything, engages with the history on multiple levels, revealing accurately and thoughtfully some of its most elusive and subjective aspects. But that is not to say that activating the imagination is always in the service of historical understanding. On the contrary, the imagination, and especially the constructed collective imaginaries that we all share in, often serves the opposite purpose, to offer cheap catharsis for other people's traumas, to exonerate or conceal guilt, to make us feel better about our pasts and our presents. In my work on Italian cinema and the memory of fascism in post-war Italy, perhaps the most seductive and widely embraced of these narratives is that of the Italiani brava gente, a certain innate goodness of Italians, both simple and complex, built on a malleable, vague, and therefore inclusive, recognizable mix made of Catholic teachings, rural solidarity, familism, Renaissance humanism, and an instinctive self-preservation built on centuries of political and civic fragmentation. If this sounds like a generalization, that's because it is. And if it sounds familiar, that's also because it is. The Italiani brava gente myth worked and still works, both domestically and internationally, because it is reassuring, and because it plays on an imaginary that widely reflects audiences' preconceptions and assumptions of both the period and the people being represented. In post-war Italian culture, the Italiani brava gente narrative served as a cornerstone of a very successful new anti-fascist identity that traded introspection for inclusiveness. And much Italian cinema contributed to that identity through political control, selective narratives and character types, and through more subtle imagery also. In Duilio Coletti's Divisione Folgore, a rare Italian war film from 1954, the Italian paratroopers fighting at El Alamein encounter a British patrol. This is super quick, so don't blink or you'll miss the whole clip. Stop. Okay. I'll explain. Stop. So the British soldier is framed as the aggressor through a low-angle shot, while the Italian response is deliberately disembodied. A rifle muzzle, deadly yet triggered by a concealed hand. And in case that was too subtle, which it almost certainly was, the fight sequence ends with an homage to the No Man's Land crater scene from All Quiet in the Western Front. What's particularly interesting there is that the assumption that Italians don't kill, or kill reluctantly, is so widespread, so expected, so necessary, one could say, that it must be employed even in an effectively reactionary film that barely disguises its nostalgia, and openly and acritically aims to reclaim the national and military pride battered by World War II. Obviously, the story is infinitely more complex. I can recommend an excellent book. And we could discuss a wealth of examples, both reinforcing and challenging these fairly dominant national narratives in Italy or anywhere else for that matter. But the point I want to make is that historical cinema intersects with the historical imagination in multiple ways. It reflects it, it shapes it, it challenges it, it reveals it, and it can mobilize it to facilitate understanding or to hinder it. And it can do so because any historical film intrinsically inhabits multiple historicities. That is, it holds a simultaneous relationships with the past that it represents, the present in which it is made, and countless futures in which it will be watched. Henri Rousseau calls historical films vectors of memory, and his language links the dynamism of cinema as a medium to Pierre Nora's lieux de mémoire, sites or realms of memory, monuments, public places, plaques, memorial windows, which you can't see, but it's there. And indeed, we find the same devices of meaning-making and nation-building in Italian management of fascist monuments as we do in Italian cinema about fascism. Condensation of history, selective or compromised narratives, omission, outright deception sometimes, contradictions, neglect, and a penchant for short-term solutions. With a certain unease, just like in Divisione Folgore, some Italian heritage policies have allowed narratives of national pride, Italy's colonial history, and the country's military campaigns to recycle interwar fascist imagery and, through it, fascist propaganda into public discourse. This is especially true of fascist-era memorials to World War I, where the names of casualties from World War II or from the fascist wars in Ethiopia and Spain are harnessed to celebrate patriotic sacrifice with no introspection or mention of whose side those soldiers fought. A martyrdom seemingly, as Guri Schwarz has put it, with no political adjectives. Of course, much more often, the fascists have gone, along with the most egregious fascist symbols. Here, this bridge not far from where I grew up, the side fascists have been hastily hacked, and the good Prince Amedeo, Duke of Aosta, who was once a symbol of Roman virtues of the Roman virtues of imperial and fascist Italy, must now be content with merely being a symbol of the Roman virtues of Italy. The rough de-inking of imperial and fascist, leaving an ungrammatical dell'Italia of the Italy orphaned of its attributes. It takes more than a chisel, a pickaxe, or some ink remover to sanitize words and iconographies that are imbued in the ideology of aggressive ethno-nationalism and racist subjugation. Monuments are literally something that reminds, from the Latin monere, which shares a root with the more active verb admonere, to remind of a debt, but also to admonish, warn, advise, urge. They are physical spaces or objects or texts through which a society decides to crystallize its collective memory and to shape our collective imaginary. Too often, this means that monuments act as surviving agents of past stereotypes, assumptions, injustices, oppression. Nevertheless, we who visit them are not passive users, because as Nora says, it is our imagination that makes these physical objects into lieux de mémoire. And we also have the opportunity to imagine a new meaning for them, to subvert them, to edit them, to curate them, and just occasionally to imagine them gone. That is another crucial role of imagination in the work of the historian. Without the imagination to ask new and subversive questions, we would not have historiography. As historians, imagination simultaneously tethers us to the past and frees us from it, allowing us to understand it, disrupt it, adapt it, and even, on occasion, fling it headfirst into the Severn. Professor Sally Hill and I started working on monuments because of Hamilton, because of Colson, and because of the Black Lives Matter inspired global challenge to memorials of traumatic pasts. And it seems to me that when the mayor of Bristol called the removal of the statue of Colson an act of historical poetry, he might as well have called it historical imagination. It reminded me of Aristotle's Poetics, where he writes, "The difference between a historian and a poet is not that one writes in prose and the other in verse. The real difference is this, that one tells what happened and the other what might happen. For this reason," Aristotle continues, "poetry is something much more significant, scientific and serious than history, because poetry tends to give general truths, while history gives particular facts." Aristotle was, of course, writing about a context where history was little more than chronicle and poetry was the philosophical study of the human condition. And even then, he may have been too dismissive. It's hard to argue. It's harder to argue with Diana and Jeff in the room, but it's hard to argue that Herodotus merely chronicled. Yet I am tempted to read in this distinction an encouragement to embrace the intuition and creativity that allow us to sense the presence of absence and offset history's many blind spots. Equipped with those tools, history makes us see the connection between what we discover and what's not there, by tracing the contours of what is. The no longer and the not yet, sure, but also the what might have been, the might be, and crucially, the ought to be. Our relationship with our pasts. We're back where we started, the apiti, the lines linking the dead and the living. Can imagination help us to be free of the past's traumatic repercussions and yet remain tethered to it? I am indebted to Ryan, Smith, and Hansen, three of our wonderful alumni, for this whakatoki, which they explain as, "I will never be lost, for I am a reflection of my ancestors. In spite of all the challenges minorities face, particularly Maori," they write, "we know that our tupuna, our ancestors, are there to guide us." In her work on Ramai Temika Hayward, Smith quotes the pioneer Wahine Maori filmmaker's description of the recreation of the Battle of Orako in the 1941 remake of Rewi's Last Stand, which Temika Hayward filmed together with her husband Rudo. On location, this is Temika Hayward says, "No one ever forgot what they had to say. And as for those wonderful lines where Hahumai gets up on the parapet and speaks, and the young Maori chief gets up, they're not acting. Yes, they're not acting. They're thinking of their ancestors and how they were, and for that time, they are their ancestors." It spoke to me of non-linear ideas of time and of a different kind of history, free to imagine the movement between different worlds and rules, spiritual and physical, past and present. History allows us to hold on to the bonds that connect us to generations unseen, sometimes unknown, sometimes speaking different languages in different countries, or languages that we have unlearned in lands that don't look the same or where we're no longer welcome. Rabbi Israel Spira, the Rebbe of Bluzhov of blessed memory, used to tell a story of how he survived a selection at the Janoska concentration camp outside Lviv or Lvov or Lemberg, depending. In cruel mockery, the Nazis had set the Jews the impossible task of jumping over a mass grave. Those who could would be spared. The Rebbe stood by the edge with a friend. He looked at his feet, the swollen feet of a 53-year-old man exhausted by hunger and illness. He looked at his friend, little more than a skeleton. Spira's friend rebelled against providing entertainment to the executioners. "Let us sit down and wait for the bullets to end our miserable existence." But the rabbi encouraged him to jump in spite of all. And as many in the audience know, when the rabbi encourages you, close your eyes, we are jumping. When they opened their eyes, they found themselves on the other side. "But how is it possible?" exclaimed the incredulous friend. "I was holding on to the merits of my ancestors," said Spira. "How did you do it?" "I was holding on to you." Tonight, with Vera and Stephen, and survivors and their descendants in the audience, I want to acknowledge those who jump and those who hold on, and those who catch us at the other end, and those who help us tell their stories. These stories are also part of the fabric of history. Imagination and its cousins, creativity and storytelling, are the tools that allow historians to go beyond writing history as a neutral, objective, value-free pursuit. Don't get me wrong, uncovering the past is worthwhile in its own right, but the historian's emotional detachment from their subject is largely an illusion. We are much better served by being self-aware, in a self-awareness that does not diffuse our moral vantage point, but harnesses it, so that our readers or our listeners can understand their own. I was privileged in 2008 when the eminent Australian historian Richard Bosworth wrote about my first book that it nourished the eternal vigilance that was first expressed by historians who themselves lived through some version of the war, a vigilance posited on reading the past with eternal criticism. I didn't quite understand it then, but I understand it better now. We live in a world where vigilance can no longer be delegated to the generation who lived through the war. And indeed, perhaps where vigilance by itself is no longer enough. Perhaps it never was. The past is not the present, and imagination cannot replace knowledge, but it is nonetheless an essential tool in the historian's craft. As Hannah Arendt, another scholar of the generation Bosworth was talking about, intuited, imagination activates the empathy that in turn enables us to suspend our assumptions and listen to other points of view. We have never needed this more than we do today. Thank you.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karangaranga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou kua tai mai nei I tēnei pō. Ki te whakaronga ki te kōrero wāhapu o āhorangi Giacomo Lichtner. Buonasera a tutti and good evening to you all. I'm Sally Hill, Professor of Global Studies here in Te Wāhanga Aronoi, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's my huge pleasure and privilege this evening to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of us all to Professor Giacomo Lichtner for this wonderful inaugural lecture. His first and his only as Professor of History at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Giacomo, thank you for a superb talk tonight. In this insightful and moving lecture, you've shown us what it means to use historical imagination with care, to negotiate the paradox of proximity and distance in grappling with traumatic pasts. You've asked us to think deeply about what it means to do this ethically and empathetically, and to consider where we locate the line between the representable and the unrepresentable. I was especially struck by the way you held those questions together across different scales and forms. You brought together, without collapsing them, the precious and fragmentary stories of your own family with the sweep of historical disruption and unthinkable loss. The close-up portrait of a man with the enormity of collective suffering, and localized narratives of mourning, memory, or self-justification with the grand rhetoric of monuments. And you helped us to see how film can be both immediate and historically layered, and how both these qualities can play a vital role in the difficult but essential work of understanding what is remote from us in time, but still present in memory, inheritance, and ongoing forms of harm. Across all of this, you kept returning us to the human, to the need to resist dehumanizing ways of seeing, to avoid easy spectacle, and to listen to the voices of suffering without appropriating it. So thank you, Giacomo, for sharing these insights with us. Your inaugural lecture has reminded us once again how very lucky we are to have you as Professor of History here at Te Herenga Waka. Your work on film, history, memory, and difficult pasts is recognised internationally, but its importance is also felt very close to home. In your teaching, in your public engagement, your work with the Holocaust Centre, and the thoughtful, humane conversations you make possible in our university and wider community. The many colleagues, students, friends, family, and community members gathered here in the room and online are a testament not only to the reach of your scholarship, but also to the generosity and care you bring to your work and to those around you. Giacomo, I hope you feel the appreciation and the aroha in the room for you tonight and from afar, and that this celebration of your work and achievements gives you some sense of the warmth, respect, and gratitude felt by all of us who have heard you speak tonight. It is now my very great pleasure to invite everyone to join us for refreshments next door in the Hunter Common Room. But before we adjourn there, please join me in thanking Professor Giacomo Lichtner once again for a truly excellent inaugural lecture. Grazie di cuore, Giacomo.